This video is going to focus on the presidency of Martin Van Buren, who was a one-term president serving from 1837 to 1841. Van Buren was the 8th president and actually the 8th vice president of the United States. He was short, he was slender, he was from New York. He was the first president to be born under the American flag, meaning to be born after America won its independence. He was known as a political strategist and a spoilsman. He rose through the political ranks via the spoils system, serving as Jackson's Secretary of State after successfully organizing campaigns for Jackson's election and re-election in New York. He was mild-mannered compared to Jackson, as you're going to see that actually turned out to be a weakness for him. There were a couple of reasons that Van Buren's presidency is considered unsuccessful. First off, he had big boots to fill, meaning it was hard to follow the act of Andrew Jackson as President of the United States. He was a man not really chosen by the common people. His name wasn't that well known, but he was chosen by the political party, and people used that against him. People felt let down by his mild manner compared to Jackson, and as Jackson's hand-picked successor, he inherited Jackson's enemies. While Van Buren was president, the U.S. was dealing with issues with Canada. Specifically, there were two brief anti-British Canadian rebellions that happened in 1837, and they were actually partially caused by Americans going up to Canada and basically stirring the pot, causing trouble between Canada and Great Britain. And these issues caused by these Americans traveling to Canada threatened war between the U.S. and Britain. Van Buren was criticized during these issues because he tried to stay neutral in the midst of these rebellions where American citizens were involved. Another reason that people disliked Van Buren was because of what was happening with Texas at the time. Anti-slavery abolitionists in the North were upset by Van Buren because Van Buren was looking to add Texas to the Union, and it presumably would have been a slave state since slaves were already living there. But these anti-slavery abolitionists in the North did not want the U.S. to add Texas as a slave state. Moving on, one of the biggest things that handicapped Van Buren during his presidency was basically a complete economic meltdown. It was called the Panic of 1837, and it happened when people were buying and investing based on unstable currency that was borrowed from wildcat banks. And it was caused mostly by land speculation in the West, which means making unwise investments in money that you're borrowing and going to be unable to pay back. So it started in Western lands, buying that, but then also unsteady or unstable investments in canals, roads, railroads, even slaves helped cause the financial meltdown of 1837. And there were three things that made this speculation problem worse. The first was the effects of the Specie Circular, which were Jackson's outgoing orders to that all people had to pay for Western lands in gold or silver, wheat crop failures caused by Hessian flies, and the failures of two British banks in 1836. Now, the reason that British bank failure is important is because it caused British creditors to call in loans from Americans who had borrowed from the British, and that caused Americans to be in a financial hardship because they didn't have the money to pay back the British when the British were demanding for their loans to be repaid. Some important effects of the economic crisis that you should be familiar with is it caused American banks to collapse by the hundreds. This is including some pet banks that were actually carrying millions in government funds. The prices for commodities. Commodity is a term for goods sold in major markets. Prices for commodities dropped drastically. Sales of public lands declined, especially in the West. Custom revenues, that's money the government makes from foreign trade. Customs revenues decreased drastically, and factories closed, unemployment skyrocketed. Last thing we look at when we're looking at Van Buren is how different political parties responded to the Panic of 1837. We're going to look at the Whigs. The Whigs are the opponents of Van Buren, the people he's going to be running against in 1841. So the Whigs wanted an expansion of the bank credit. This is how they thought they could solve the problem. They wanted higher tariffs, more government involvement overall. They wanted subsidies. That's when the government gives assistance to certain businesses for internal improvements. Whigs thought the government should be hands-on with this issue. Van Buren and the Democrats responded to the Panic of 1837 in more of a hands-off way, because that went along with the Jacksonian belief of keeping the government out of the economy. Van Buren pushed Congress to force through something called the Divorce Bill, which was a piece of legislation that would separate government and banking altogether. Officially, it was known as the Independent Treasury Bill, but it was nicknamed the Divorce Bill because it would permanently separate the government from banking. So in the midst of an economic crisis, meltdown, lots of people losing their jobs and factories shutting down, Van Buren wants to make the government even more hands-off during a crisis. So you can see why Van Buren became unpopular quickly. And then people were unhappy with his divorce bill. The Whigs condemned it, and they didn't like it because it made their hopes of renewing a national bank even smaller. Even Democrats were not fully in support of this divorce bill. They thought it was weak, and they wanted to return to the pet bank system that helped farmers out west. All in all, this independent treasury bill was passed in 1840, but it was repealed by the Whigs in 1841 when the next president would come into office. And it was sort of passed again in 1846 and continued till the Civil War. This idea of how much should the government be involved in the economy continued to be a major issue through the presidency of Abe Lincoln.